Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking to you about plate tectonics and the types of plate margins that we can find. As a quick recap, you'll remember that the crust of the Earth, which is the outermost layer, solid, is divided into 7 major tectonic plates, like the Pacific plate, the African plate and the Eurasian plate, as well as several minor tectonic plates, smaller ones. Now those plates are constantly in motion, driven by the moving convection currents in the Earth's mantle. These arrows indicate the direction of movement of the different plates. It's also important to notice that where plates meet, we'll often get lines or broad belts of volcanoes, as indicated by these yellow triangles, or earthquakes, as indicated by the red dots. Probably the clearest example of this is what we call the Pacific Ring of Fire, where we have a line of volcanoes largely around most of the Pacific plate's edge, as well as lots of earthquakes too. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, running surprisingly down the middle of the Atlantic, also demonstrates this pattern, with volcanoes and earthquakes occurring along it. Where you have plates moving apart, like at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, that is called constructive margin, or a constructive margin, where new crust is being formed and you'll get some volcanic eruptions. Where you have two plates colliding or moving together, as you can see here, the Nazca plate moving towards the South American plate, then you get destructive plate margins, where oceanic crust is subducted, forced underneath the continental crust. And here you'll get big earthquakes and volcanoes. Finally, at a few places, you get tectonic plates moving side by side, such as the Pacific plate here and the North American plate. Where that happens, we call it a conservative margin, and here you'll often get powerful earthquakes. Returning to the pattern of earthquakes and volcanoes, if you're asked to describe the distribution of earthquakes and or volcanoes, we can say that they are in broad belts along the margins of tectonic plates. So where two plates meet, we have broad belts of volcanoes and or earthquakes. However, there are some exceptions where we get some earthquakes occurring in the middle of plates, well away from the major plate boundaries, as well as some volcanoes, such as Hawaii, an island chain of volcanoes that we'll find pretty much in the middle of the Pacific plate, well away from the major plate margins. This is called a hotspot, and it's where an upwelling in the mantle has created a particularly active or volcanically active area in the middle of a tectonic plate. Good. So we're going to go through all of the different margins, or the 3 different margins, in lots of detail. Before you do that, I would like you to make a copy of this table that I'm about to show, so that as I go through each of the different plate margins, you can record the crucial information and build up a clear picture for yourself. So please make a copy of that diagram now. So we're going to start off by looking at a constructive plate margin. And I think the most important thing to realise about constructive plate margin is that new land is constructed or created. So new land created. And let's look at how that happens. Most constructive plate margins are under oceans, not all, but most. And we have the ocean here, as you can see, as well as our thin oceanic crust that is underlying the oceans. And beneath the oceanic crust, we come to the Earth's mantle. Within the mantle, we have convection currents, so uprising of hot material, that are circulating, it's not very helpful, circulating within the mantle. So these are called convection currents. These convection currents, when they reach the oceanic crust, they are forced to go from side or to either side. And we call that divergence. So they diverge, and because this is a very thick and viscous material, there is a lot of friction that occurs between the convection current material and the oceanic crust. So we have lots of friction. That friction has the effect of pulling the oceanic crust in two different directions. So this side of the diverging convection current will move to the right, and this side, the oceanic crust, will move to the left. So if we're thinking about the direction of movement, it's well represented by these two arrows, and the tectonic plates are moving away from each other. The tectonic plates are moving away from each other. That movement apart creates opportunity for upwelling magma from the mantle to rise through the oceanic crust. So upwelling mantle, or magma, sorry, from the mantle rises through oceanic crust. As it does so, it will cause numerous small earthquakes. So one of the types of tectonic activity that we will find at constructive plate margins are small earthquakes. The magma will continue to rise, and there are often volcanic eruptions underneath the sea that build to form an ocean ridge. So we have volcanic eruptions, another type of tectonic activity, building to form ocean ridges. I'm sorry about that beeping, that was very poor planning on my part. I'll try and turn that off. In certain places, that volcanic activity is so large that the ocean ridge will actually break the surface of the ocean and form new land at the surface. Volcanism here, which is still occurring, tends to be very hot and runny lava. So we have hot and runny lava, and this creates volcanoes that have nice shallow sloping sides and are quite wide as that runny lava moves away, a long way away from the volcano cone. And we call that kind of volcano a shield volcano. A perfect example of where this has happened is in Iceland, which is on the mid-Atlantic ridge. So that line of underwater volcanoes and mountains running down the middle of the Atlantic, where Iceland is, has broken through the surface of the ocean to form a new island. And the two plates that are either side of Iceland, moving in opposite directions, are the Eurasian plate and the North American plate. So there you have it, constructive plate margins. Make sure that you've got all the information on your table, including the direction of movement, the types of tectonic activity you will find, as well as an example of where this type of plate margin can be found on the Earth. Let me ask you some questions. What is causing the oceanic crust to pull apart at constructive plate margins? Well done. It is the convection currents in the mantle. But why do the convection currents in the mantle pull the ocean crust apart? Good, because there is a lot of friction between the convection current and the oceanic crust, therefore pulling it apart. As the oceanic crust pulls apart, what is able to rise up through the crust? Well done, magma, and we can describe that as upwelling magma. What forms at the surface where the magma rises through the crust? Good, volcanoes. And what other tectonic activity might we expect to find at constructive plate margins? Lovely, small earthquakes. Don't forget they are relatively low magnitude earthquakes. In a few places, these volcanic eruptions form new land breaking through the surface of the sea. Please give me an example of such a place and tell me the tectonic plates that are involved. Yes, yes and yes, very good. It is Iceland, which is formed on the mid-Atlantic ridge between the Eurasian plate and the North American plate, which are moving in different directions. Very good. Now have a go at answering this exam style question. So here's a cheeky little question, and very typical of questions that you'll get throughout your geography papers 1 and 2 and 3. They provide a figure for you to look at, understand, and crucially use in your answer. So to begin with, we'll read all the information in sequence as you should in your exam. Study figure 2, a map of Iceland showing the tectonic plates. Here is the figure 2. Let me study it. It has information about the North American plate, that is here, the Eurasian plate, that is here, and then what do these arrows mean? Let me check the key. Direction of plate movement, fine. So Eurasian plate is moving to the east, North American plate is moving to the west. Oh, and here's an extra box of information. Rate of plate movement, 2.5 centimetres a year. Okay, extra information, not just there for prettiness, it's there because they might be encouraging you to use it. But also, what are these? What is this zone? What is this shaded area? Let me check. Ah, that's the mid-Atlantic ridge, the plate margin. So that is the margin between those two tectonic plates, North American and Eurasian. So far, so good. Some triangles. Can have a guess at what they mean, but let me check. Yeah, that's a volcano. So we have volcanoes along the ridge. Fine. And then this black dot is the capital city. That's Reykjavik over here in the the west of the country, and then several hundred earthquakes are recorded in Iceland every year. Some have magnitudes of over 6 on the Richter scale. More information, not just there for being pretty. So, now let me read the actual question. Using figure 2, there it is, and your own understanding, I want to stop there. This is a very important point. This is not an option, it's not negotiable, it's not like if you feel like it. It is telling you to use figure 2. So, if you do not use figure 2, then you will be limited from getting the top marks, which is 5 or 6 out of 6. You must refer to information on this figure. But crucially, it says, and your own understanding. If you are only using this figure, because perhaps you haven't done enough revision, you are going to be limiting yourself to not getting the highest marks. You must bring in new information and new understanding in your answer. So, both things need to be used, the figure and your own understanding. Now, let's get on to the actual question. Suggest how plate movements cause tectonic hazards in Iceland. So they are asking about the plate movements and how that causes tectonic hazards. What are tectonic hazards? Oh yes, things like volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, those three mainly. So, what tectonic hazards are shown on my map? Oh yes, I have information about volcanoes and where they're located, and I have also information about earthquakes. So there's 2 points that I can make straight off. I can talk about the volcanoes of Iceland and what causes them, and then I can talk about the earthquakes of Iceland and what causes them. Now actually, we can talk about the direction of plate movement. That's important because it asks, but what this figure does not tell us is why are those plates moving in those directions? What is happening underneath the crust, beneath this margin? That is your own understanding. By telling them how these plates are being moved, you are introducing your own knowledge and understanding. Then you can use the plate names that are given from the figure. You can talk about the rate of movement from the figure, and you can also talk about the distribution of these volcanoes from the figure. So that's great. That's lots of your own understanding and information from the figure. And when you structure these points, you need to make a simple point, such as Iceland has one tectonic hazard that Iceland has are volcanoes. Then you're going to explain how they're caused, so that takes probably a sentence or two, and then you can develop that with some extra information, detail or example. For example, we know what kind of volcanoes we find at this type of plate margin. So tell the examiner that, show them that you have understanding that these volcanoes have a certain type of lava and they have a certain shape. And then you can talk about whether that affects the hazards that they may pose. Good. You're doing exactly the same for your earthquakes. They've given you some information here, but once again, they haven't told you how the earthquakes are caused. You need to make sure you do that. And you then need to talk about the magnitude of those earthquakes and how that might affect the hazard presented to people. So, lots of instructions there. I want you to pause the video now, and you are going to attempt on lined paper to write a 6-mark question. Best quality you can, as much information as you can. And after that, I'd like you to unpause it and have a look at the model answer that follows, and then green pen to add in information that you might have missed, or phrases and connections to make your answer as fully sophisticated as it could have been. We're aiming for absolute perfection here. Good luck, and I'll be back in a minute to share with you a model. So here we go. First of all, I want to tell you what the colours mean. Green is a point, orange is an explanation, and then red is extra development that I'm putting in to try and make sure that I get to level 3, the highest marks. So, point number 1. One tectonic hazard the movement of plates in Iceland causes are volcanoes, which are found in a linear pattern along the mid-Atlantic ridge. I've underlined this because all of that information comes from figure 2. Then I want to explain the fact that we get volcanoes. These occur in Iceland because, key connective word to explain, it is a constructive plate margin and the plates are diverging. This information here is not given to me on the figure, so it is showing my own understanding and using of words like diverging, again, not on the figure. That just means moving apart, more technical. Driven, that should say by convection currents in the mantle that rise and diverge beneath the crust. Again, this is all my own understanding that I am helping to improve my answer with. Then I think, right, let me really show off, tell them everything I know. The friction drags the North American and the Eurasian plates in different directions at a rate of 2.5 centimeters a year. I've underlined these bits because they're directly from figure 2. Once again, fulfilling my command to use figure 2. This creates space for magma from the mantle to move upwards through the crust at the margin and erupt as runny lava, which tends to form low gradient, that means shallow sloped, and wide shield volcanoes, which could pose a hazard to people living nearby. Once again, packed with information from my own knowledge and understanding, magma moving up through the crust, erupting as runny lava, low gradient and wide shield volcanoes. This is all extra information that's going to be ensuring I move to the top of that level, top of that marks. Second point is a bit shorter because I've done a lot of the explanation in here. Another tectonic hazard that the movement of the plates creates are hundreds of earthquakes, some of which have a magnitude of over 6 on the Richter scale. Once again, I've underlined this because this is from figure 2. I explain it. These are caused by the movement of magma through the crust and the subsequent movement of the plates. Little bit more information. They are rarely of very high magnitude, and so the hazard threat is not very high, but could do damage to local infrastructure. So once again, I'm applying my own knowledge and understanding to make the most of figure 2. So take a moment to freeze this and with green pen add in words, facts or phrases, even a whole sentence maybe, to improve your own answer. Do that now, please. Okay, let's turn our attention to destructive plate margins. And the important thing to note here is that crust is destroyed. So let's see how that happens. Well, first of all, we have the sea that is overlying our oceanic crust. That is crust that tends to be found under oceans, and importantly, it is dense, heavy. Underneath the oceanic crust, we have our mantle. And the mantle continues to circulate with convection currents, and so this will continue to move our oceanic crust because of the frictional drag of the mantle on the oceanic crust. And so we have our oceanic crust moving in that direction. Now, at destructive plate boundaries, we have two plates that are moving towards each other. They are converging. And meeting our oceanic crust, we have a continental crust, which is less dense, so less heavy, and they are moving towards each other, converging. So the important thing to know here is that when the less dense continental crust collides with the dense oceanic crust, the dense heavy material is forced underneath the lighter material. We call the process of being one of the oceanic crust being forced under the continental crust as subduction. So the oceanic crust is subducted. As it subducts, it moves deeper into the mantle, and the friction between the oceanic crust and the continental crust causes huge pressure to build up, and that's because of the friction. And eventually that pressure will be released suddenly to form large earthquakes. So we get large earthquakes as a result. That is one type of tectonic activity that we get at destructive plate margins. Earthquakes with high magnitudes. As the oceanic crust moves deeper into the mantle, it will start to melt because of the high temperatures. And as it melts, the magma that it forms is relatively light in comparison to the mantle and will start to rise up. That magma then rises through the continental crust, and you know where this is going, to eventually break through the surface and form volcanoes. Now these volcanoes are very powerful events. They are explosive, often causing widespread destruction and usually without significant warning. These are called composite volcanoes. They have steep sides and this is another form of tectonic activity that we would find at destructive margins. Composite volcanoes, explosive in nature. Let me just put down here about the melting oceanic crust, and the lighter magma. So in terms of landforms, one of the landforms that we can find are volcanoes. But also you'll notice here that the ocean is significantly deeper just at the boundary of where subduction is occurring. And that is because the crust deforms downwards as it is subducted to form this very deep area of water. And we call these deep areas of water ocean trenches. They are the deepest parts of our oceans on planet Earth. The other thing to be aware of is that as the oceanic plate has been sitting underneath the ocean, over millions of years, sediments have built up in thick layers on the surface of that oceanic crust. And as those sediments are subducted when we meet the continental crust, this leading edge of the continental crust acts like a bulldozer to build up those sediments and causes them to, under great pressure, fold in on themselves, making high mountains. And because all of that sediment has been folded under great pressure, we call these tall mountains fold mountains. So there we have two other landforms that we could expect to find at destructive margins: ocean trenches and fold mountains. Now, as a real-world example, probably the best bet is to look to South America, where we have the South American plate, continental, converging with the oceanic plate that is called the Nazca plate. So the Nazca plate is moving towards the east, and the South American plate is moving westwards. Where they meet, we find this line of fold mountains that are called the Andes, and they run down the length of South America, occasionally with composite volcanoes, and an example of that is Mount Cotopaxi in Ecuador. So that's your good example of a real-life destructive plate margin. The last thing to say is that the trench where the oceanic Nazca plate and the continental South American plate are meeting is called the Peru-Chile Trench. Great, so let's have some questions. First off, and most importantly, which type of crust is most dense? Yes, the oceanic crust. As a result of being more dense, what happens to the oceanic crust when it collides with continental crust? Well done. It is forced under. And what is the technical term for being forced under when the one plate is forced under another? Exactly, subduction. So please remember to use that key word in your exams. As the oceanic crust is subducted beneath the continental crust, why do we get large earthquakes occurring, or earthquakes with high magnitude? Very good. Yeah, exactly. So we have huge amounts of friction between the two plates, which leads to pressure building up and then sudden releases of that pressure. Lovely. Continuing on a bit further, what later happens to our oceanic crust as it subducts deeper into the mantle? That's right, it will melt. And that melted material, why does it start to rise up towards the surface? Good, because it's lighter or less dense than the surrounding mantle. As that magma rises through the continental crust, what kind of volcanoes are formed? And describe their characteristics, please. Good. Composite volcanoes, exactly. They're very explosive and they have steep sides. In terms of landforms, What landforms can you find at destructive plate margins? That's right, fold mountains and ocean trenches, as well as volcanoes. Jolly good. And how would you describe the movement of plates at a destructive plate margin? Yes, they are moving towards each other, and in more technical language we could say, exactly, they are converging. Nice one. Finally, give me a real-world example and mention some of the landforms that have been created as a result. Yes, so the Nazca plate is converging with the South American plate. It might be worth mentioning that the Nazca plate is moving eastwards and the South American plate westwards. But other than that, you were completely correct. Well done. So as they collide, they form the Peru-Chile Trench, as well as the sediments being built up into fold mountains called the Andes. Very nice. Okay, let's put all of this new knowledge to the test, and I would like you to have a go at the following exam-style question. So this question is very similar to the one that you've just answered on constructive plate margins. So have a look, follow through the same process of making sure you read everything on the map, noticing what the question is asking you to do and where it wants you to take information from, and then write your 6-mark answer. In terms of timing, you're probably looking to spend about a minute looking at the map and planning, and then around 6 minutes writing your answer with a point, an explanation, and then lots of lovely development for your own knowledge that will help you get to 5 and 6 marks out of 6. Good luck, write it down once again, pause the presentation, and then when you're done, have a look at the next screen to see where you could have improved your answer and annotate it with green pen. Hey, where do you find the Andes? No, they're at the end of your armies. So here we go, our final type of plate margin. And here we're going to be looking at conservative plate margins. And the important thing to realise here is that new land or land, no. So let's get on to our final type of plate margin, and that is conservative plate margins. The important thing to realise here is that the crust is not created or destroyed. And because of that, we have no volcanism, no volcanoes occurring at this type of plate margin. So what is going on? Well, here we see the boundary between two tectonic plates. And at a conservative plate margin, the direction of movement is that these plates are moving past each other, or they are sliding past each other. So this plate may well be moving in this direction, and this plate may be moving in this direction. The reason I've drawn this faintly is because what often happens is the plates are actually moving in the same or similar directions, but at different rates. So this plate, which I'm going to draw with a thicker arrow, is moving at a faster rate towards the northwest, whereas this plate is moving more slowly. And that has the effect of meaning that this plate is sliding past this plate here. Now, this is not an easy movement, this movement of the two plates past one another. We are dealing with huge chunks of the Earth's crust that interlock along rough edges. As a result of that, we will often get high levels of friction, causing massive pressure to build up. And we can represent that by the plates are locking here, and that pressure is building and building until there is a sudden release of pressure. And that sudden release is an earthquake, which are often high magnitude and destructive earthquakes. So, a real-world example of such a plate margin, where the plates are moving past one another, is the San Andreas Fault. And that is the margin between two plates, the Pacific plate and the North American plate. Once again, the Pacific plate is moving at a faster rate to the northwest than the North American plate, and so is sliding past the North American plate. Very nice. Along the San Andreas Fault, we can find several large cities. So, for example, in the north, we have San Francisco, and further south, you might find, or you do find, Los Angeles. Big cities that in the past have suffered major earthquakes and now have many of their buildings designed to withstand the powerful forces of a high magnitude earthquake. Great, let's have a few questions. So, what is the direction of plate movement at a conservative plate margin? Good. They are moving past each other, side by side. And what tectonic hazards would I not find at a conservative plate margin? Good. We wouldn't find volcanoes. Why do we not find volcanoes at conservative plate margins? Exactly right. It's because the crust is not created or destroyed here. So what tectonic hazards can I expect to find? Earthquakes, well done. And how would you describe the magnitude of these earthquakes? Yes, they can be very high magnitude, sometimes 8 to 9 on the Richter scale. In a real-world example, which two plates are moving past one another side by side? Very good, the Pacific plate and the North American plate, well done. And what is the name of the fault that we would find at the margin of those two plates? The San Andreas fault, indeed. Good stuff. Now, have a go once more at answering an exam-style question talking about the tectonic hazards and how they are caused at this plate margin. Pause it and then compare to my model answer and green pen. Well done, and signing out. Bye-bye.